Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, all southern states, and all popular places to study the civil rights movement. However, racial segregation resided as far up as the westernmost tip of the United States. Though the civil rights movement is not typically associated with the Northwest, the racial tensions in Seattle at this time depict that racism and black struggles were not just a Southern occurrence, but a nationwide dilemma.
The place where racial tensions were most prevalent in Seattle was called the Central District. This district was the inner city area where the majority of black Seattleites lived. Overpopulated, run down, and predominantly poor made for less than ideal living conditions in the district. These conditions were also greatly reflected in the public schools of the district, which were also predominantly black. Considering that the black population of Seattle only held 10% of representation during the 1960s, racial issues were easy for the white majority to ignore.
The poor conditions of the black public schools of the Central District resulted in the inadequate education blacks were receiving at these very schools. Key civil rights organizations believed that the state of Seattle had yet to react to the 1954 decision of Brown v. Board of Education, which called for the integration of public schools nationwide. Therefore, they took it in their own hands to begin the process of desegregating Seattle public schools. The event that incited what would become a rather long battle was a 1966 boycott of Seattle public schools. The boycott lasted 2 days, resulted in 55% of the black student body participating, and even brought out a population of Asian and white supporters. While students participating attended freedom schools, the boycott gained much media coverage. The Facts newspaper declared,
Those who keep calling for patrols in the central area should be more interested in patrolling the miseducation of black youth. The school officials, well endowed with backgrounds in white mythology, do not seem persuaded that the crime of messing over the minds of our youth is out.
Boycotting was not the only tactic employed by integrationists. The 1966 boycott was a response to a failed tactic that the Central Area Civil Rights Committee had attempted 3 years prior. In August 1963, the CARC organized a voluntary busing system called the Voluntary Racial Transfer Program. This program gave blacks the opportunity to go to predominantly white public schools in the suburbs, and white students the opportunity to go to predominantly black public schools in the Central District. Catherine Bullitt, a white supporter of desegregation, shares her perspective on why integration was so important at that point in time.
We started with one school, Madrona, and then gradually went to the other Central District schools, and it was a way of keeping able students, black and white, in the schools at a time when there were a lot moving out and families moving out.
Bullitt was directly involved with the organization of the busing initiative. However, it did not go quite as planned. As one might imagine, the number of white parents and students interested in being bused out of their neighborhoods was rather low.
And I also worked with getting people from Bellevue and North Shore and Queen Anne and West Seattle to come into the Central District schools, trying to, keep or help the mix grow at a time when people were leaving.
In spite of efforts made by Catherine Bullitt and groups such as the Central Area Civil Rights Committee, not everyone agreed that desegregation was the answer to the problem of poor education in the black community. In 1967, Stokely Carmichael, who was strongly involved with SNCC at the time, gave a speech at Garfield High School which emphasized the importance of building up the black community and focusing on improving black schools. He argued against the effort to send black students outside their communities to white schools by stating,
What must be abolished is not the black community, but the dependent colonial status forced upon it. White people assume they can give freedom, but nobody gives freedom. They can only deny it. We are all born free. We are enslaved by institutionalized racism.
This speech sparked the rise of the Black Power movement in Seattle, which became the #1 opponent to conservative integrationists.
Soon after this speech, a branch of the Black Panther Party was founded in Seattle. Carmichael's speech was also seen by many students as a call to leadership in the black community. Elmer Dixon, a former member of the Black Students Union at Garfield High School, recalls how Carmichael's speech inspired him to think about how blacks often internalize the negative stereotypes associated with them.
It's a good example of how institutionalized racism, it runs so deep in our culture, in U.S. culture, to the extent that blacks don't even know that they dislike themselves because of the negative programming.
Carmichael's speech not only deeply affected the students of Garfield, but also the larger black community of Central District. As Black Power ideology gained more and more attention from the wider black community, the Central District began rallying support behind this new idea through the formation of the pro-Black Power newspaper called the Afro-American Journal. Within this newspaper was a column written by Cliff Hooper that specifically addressed the tension between integrationists and segregationists when it came to the topic of education. In an issue dated Thursday, July 11th, 1968, Hooper discusses the dangers of an education system designed to keep black students inferior. He states,
It would appear that American white society prepared white people to teach black people how to survive in a system designed to destroy black people that was created and is maintained by white people.
In another article dated November 21st, 1968, Hooper poses a series of questions that support his belief that one of the solutions to improve education for black students is to hire more black teachers in order to designate role models for students. Hooper asks,
Who will teach him to survive as a black human being? Are they experienced at surviving as a black human being in America?
As the battle between integrationists and segregationists continued, interracial tensions escalated. The black community of the Central District made their support for separate black schools clear and eventually forced pro-integration groups like the CACRC to step down. Despite these small Black Power victories, Seattle's moderate conservative population remained the overwhelming majority, and integrationist leaders remained largely politically influential. Furthermore, small but significant communities of white supporters strengthened the efforts of the black integrationist leaders in Seattle. In 1968, one of the first signs of integration appeared in the form of a policy aimed at integrating a group of 4 middle schools. However, initiatives to desegregate public schools quickly lost momentum, and the school board became lackadaisical. It wasn't until 1977 when the NAACP, along with a few other groups, pushed them to make school desegregation their priority, that the Seattle School District created a busing initiative called the Seattle Plan, which was in place through the 1990s.
As the racial battle continued throughout the late 20th century and even the early 2000s, we learned that these racial issues were not simply concentrated in the South. The lack of passion and rage in Seattle was largely due to apathy from the white majority. This apathy wasn't as physically debilitating to black lives as the Southern police brutality and KKK efforts. However, effective change was quite difficult to enact because of the lack of urgency within Seattle's overwhelming majority. As Seattle moves forward, it still struggles to resolve the aftermath of segregation today. This path of slow and steady, yet determined efforts to create social awareness about racial issues of inequality and injustice mirrors the state of America as a whole.
It spoiled my act as a clown. I had it made